is 1814. With the War of 1812 still raging, President James Madison has fled Washington after the British burned the White House, but the tide is turning. By year's end, the war is won, and Britain finally accepts American independence. Napoleon has been defeated and exiled to Elba, and the Star-Spangled Banner is published with words by Francis Scott Key. In Rhode Island, the War of 1812 was generally not popular, but despite talk of secession, troops were recruited for the war effort. Native son Oliver Hazard Perry had gained fame through decisive naval victories in the Great Lakes, and the town of Providence was growing and was now home to some 11,000 inhabitants. And in June of 1814, the handsome, twin-towered wooden meeting house that had stood on this site for 20 years was burned to the ground when an arsonist set lighted candles in one of the columns on the west face. The minister, the Reverend Henry Eads, later reflected on the terrible fire in the fervent style of the times.
Although the materials of our former holy and beautiful house were of a combustible kind, no idea was more remote to our minds than the possibility of destruction by fire. And had the earth opened her jaws and swallowed the building wholly within, the surprise could hardly have been greater than when we saw it falling prey to the ravages of the cruel and devouring flames.
But the congregation quickly rallied. Funds were raised through the sale of pews, more about that later, and through the Benevolent Congregational Society, a separate financial body whose members since 1770 had raised and overseen the use of funds for the benefit of the church. In fact, Benevolent Street is named for the Benevolent Society. In less than a year after the devastating fire, the congregation had hired John Holden Green, a local architect and member of the congregation, had approved his design, and in May of 1815, with great fanfare, had laid the cornerstone for their new building, this time built of stone. Just a little over a year later, on Sunday, October 31st, 1816, the congregation gathered for the dedication of the building, which featured a sermon by the Reverend Mr. Eads and a prayer offered by Dr. Asa Messer, president of Brown University. Pew number 75 in the northeast corner was given to the architect by a grateful congregation. He said it allowed him the best view of his creation.
Greetings to you all. My name is John Holden Green, and people have said that this is my masterpiece. Like most of my colleagues in America, I am self-taught, drawing my inspiration from pattern books and from the work of fellow architects. It will give me great pleasure to draw your attention to some of the special design features of our sanctuary. First and foremost, as in any congregational church of our day, is the pulpit. It dominates the room as the preaching of the word dominates the worship service. I followed a design by my fellow architect from Boston, Mr. Charles Bulfinch. The 12-foot height allows the entire congregation to see and to hear the minister. I had intended the structure to be built of pine, but several young men in the congregation raised the funds to enable it to be fashioned of mahogany. To further emphasize the importance of the pulpit, I placed 3 panels rising to an arch containing a fluted fan with a ring of plumes. The panels reflect the windows as the pulpit opens a window to the Word. To the right of the pulpit stands one of the 10 two-storied windows surrounding the space. The clear panes allow the light to flood the sanctuary. I chose to make these the full height of the room, rather than the single-story windows that you will see on the Baptist Meeting House just down the street. If you let your eye travel up along the trim, alongside the windows, you will see an ornamented capitol, which reflects the capitals on the 4 Corinthian columns. You will notice various kinds of columns around the sanctuary, on the pulpit, around the windows, alongside the doors, but the 4 colossal Corinthian columns are the most notable. I drew inspiration for these columns from the work of Sir Christopher Wren of London. I also used his idea of mounting the columns on pedestals so the full height of the column is visible above the box pews. Surmounting the columns is the segmented shallow dome with its ornate plaster medallion in the center. The 4 corners of the ceiling are filled with delicate fans which reflect the fans above the pulpit. There was a candlelit chandelier which I designed, but it has been replaced by this very elegant chandelier. I see that some clever mechanic has captured the light inside the glass to light the room. Although the organ appears to have been replaced since my day, we were able to save the pipes from the original organ in the second meeting house. And I designed the central space of the balcony to give it prominence opposite the pulpit. Still adorning the front of the balcony is the handsome Simon Willard clock, which has reckoned the hours in the life of the meeting house these past 200 years. So this is my masterpiece. I wish you the delight of it for another 200 years to come.
Thank you, Mr. Green, and rest assured that we do indeed delight in your creation every Sunday. I mentioned a few minutes ago that the meeting house was funded in part by the sale of pews. Pew sales were a common practice in the early 19th century to pay the expenses of building maintenance and the hiring of clergy. Members of the congregation could purchase a pew, initially in an auction, and were then expected to pay an annual rental fee. A few of the original pew holders in 1816 are scattered among us today.
Good morning. My name is Sullivan Dorr, and those of you who are native to our state may have come across the name in your history studies. I was a prominent businessman, and I made a fortune with my ships in the China trade. Indeed, I dabbled in diplomacy there as American consul from 1800 to 1804. My son, Thomas, in 1841, would lead the Dorr Rebellion in a far-sighted, if unsuccessful, effort to broaden the right to vote in our state. My pew is number 2, right here behind that of the minister, his family, and guests. I bid $690. That is equivalent to $11,500 in your currency today. The pews towards the front of the church were the most expensive. In fact, this, my pew, was the most expensive in the churches of our town of Providence.
Greetings. My name is John Howland. I came to Providence from Newport as an apprentice barber in 1770, and eventually became an important, if not wealthy, citizen of this town. I was instrumental in establishing free public education in the city of Providence and served as its town treasurer and auditor for many, many years. I was also clerk of this congregation. As a longtime friend of Paul Revere, I persuaded him to have his foundry cast the bell that hangs in our new steeple. My pew is number 49, which I purchased for $135. As you can see, the cost of the pews decreases the further back you are from the pulpit.
Good to see you here today. My name is John Jenks. I'm a deacon of this congregation. I accompanied our minister, Mr. Eads, to Baltimore in 1819, where I was privileged to hear the Reverend Ellery Channing set forth his beliefs in the Unitarian religion. We were there at the ordination of Reverend Jared Sparks. I was able to purchase this seat, number 47, for $350.
The congregation prospered in the years following the completion of the third meeting house, so much so that in 1836, the congregation voted to make changes to accommodate the larger attendance. Again, they raised the necessary funds from within the congregation and from the Benevolent Society. Two of these changes are clearly visible. The parsonage pew and its counterpart across the center aisle were reconfigured into this open shape we see today, and the pulpit itself was lowered by the removal of the foot-high platform it had originally stood on. The two boxes installed at the foot of the columns behind the pulpit cover the gap left by the move. Repairs were also made to the steeple, which had been damaged in a storm in 1835. In the process, the steeple was lowered by 11 feet to its current height of 189 feet, 1 inch. At the same time, the painted and gilded clock faces were installed on 3 sides of the steeple. But the most significant change is one that is also visible, but most of us have never noticed it. By reducing the depth of the existing pews, the congregation was able to add 2 rows of pews across the sanctuary, one behind row 8 and one behind row 14. The doors on these pews were labeled A through L instead of numbers as on the existing pews. 2 additional pews, M and N, were added on either side of the pulpit. The pews were also made more comfortable, really. By slightly slanting the backs and adding seat cushions. But not everyone was pleased.
My name is Albert G. Green. I am son of John Holden Green. This meeting house was perfect the way my father designed it, and the change to the pulpit is the work of vandals.
Well, every church has a curmudgeon or two. We have another visitor among us today who was witness to changes in the 1860s that dramatically altered the appearance of our sanctuary.
Greetings to you all. My name is Joseph Eat. I was 34 years old, married to my second wife, Julia Lippert, when we purchased pew number 92 for $250. That's 4,500 currency. I was a prosperous dry goods merchant at 25 Westminster Street, where I watched the handsome arcade building in 1828. I remained a member of this congregation until my death in 1878 at the age of 95, when I was laid to rest in our burial ground in the Swan Point Cemetery. My friends, I look around me in amazement. This is the elegant sanctuary that I knew for 50 years. Yet the last time I laid eyes on this meeting house, it had undergone a number of significant changes to Mr. Green's original design, far more than those which so upset his son. It was 1863, and I was in my 80s and far too old for drastic changes when the congregation made a number of improvements to the sanctuary. Queen Victoria was on the throne in England, and great changes in decorative taste were sweeping the world, capturing the imagination of the populace and our congregation. So, to reflect the fashion of the times, the clear panes of glass in these soaring windows were all removed and replaced with diamond-shaped colored glass set in lead. And there's more. As reported by the Providence Journal in 1864, the walls, the dome, the woodwork were all repainted in a combination of tints comprising more than 100 shades, etched in gold. There, behind the pulpit, an elaborate multicolored cross was painted. Now, other changes were more practical and more welcome. In place of the central chandelier with its wax-dripping candles, a circle of gas jets was installed around the rim of the dome, greatly improving illumination during the services. Now you could read the words in the hymnal. Alongside the streets outside, great slabs of blue slate were laid, so no more muddy dresses on the ladies and no more muddy shoes. Are they still there, those stone sidewalks? A most definite improvement. In honor of the brave men and boys from our congregation who served in the Civil War to preserve the Union, placed in the southwest corner. I see it is still there. Sarah, the young girl, on that day when the train left from the railroad station with those men, many never to return. She was to recall those days in later years.
Let's see now. My first memory is of the Sunday before the 1st Regiment left for the front in 1861, when so many of our boys came with their parents for the last service. The blue coats and brass buttons of the uniforms fascinated the children not yet old enough to realize the sadness. Dr. Hall in the pulpit, solemn and earnest, shared the feelings of his people. His son was among the soldiers. The church was one in loyalty and devotion to the country.
Dr. Hall's son survived, but so many did not return. It is a fitting memorial. Good people, I bear witness to the significant changes to this meeting house during my lifetime, but I am delighted to see that at some point our sanctuary was returned to its simple beauty. The light flowing into this amazing space is wonderful, such a marvel. I love this building. I love this building and all the precious memories it holds for me. So may it be with you.
Many of the changes in the 1860s that Joseph Sweet described were undone for the 1916 centennial year of the Meeting House. By then, the Victorian style had fallen out of fashion, and the congregation elected to return the interior to something like its original appearance. The considerable funds needed were raised within the congregation. The centennial restoration included installing panes of slightly tinted clear glass in the windows that we see today. The multicolored paint scheme was replaced with complementary shades of gray, and the cross was removed from above the pulpit. And in October 1916, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of their newly refurbished meeting house, the congregation held a 3-day event that included the Sunday worship service, led by the minister, the Reverend Dr. Augustus Menden Lord, with the music that was being performed today, a Monday evening parish supper, and a Tuesday evening worship service that included greetings from Brown President Reverend William H.P. Fonts, and an address by the president of the American Unitarian Association, the Reverend Samuel Eliot. Some years later, a memorial to the men of the congregation who served in World War I was erected on the north wall, opposite the Civil War Memorial. And in 1926, the handsome gilt bronze chandelier, now hanging from the center of the dome, was installed when the building was finally electrified. For many years, the congregation enjoyed its restored meeting house, but as the 150th anniversary approached in 1966, the congregation decided to commemorate the milestone by sprucing up the interior of the building. Again, the necessary funds were raised from within the congregation. New carpeting was laid, the walls were painted in lighter tones, more in keeping with the original colors, and additional maintenance and repairs were carried out. A sesquicentennial celebration was scheduled to be held in October. But on August 23rd, catastrophe struck. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, during a heavy local thunderstorm, lightning struck the base of the steeple. It traveled into the interior, where it blew the organ apart and sent organ pipes flying through the sanctuary. Fire spread throughout the organ and then rose into the steeple. Dr. Robert Schacht, the church's minister since 1931, later recalled the events of that day.
My wife and I were in Cumberland Hill when the fire started. Our good neighbor next to our church, Kenneth Sherman, promptly sent us word. We drove at once to Providence. We found our church president, Mr. Timothy Buffum, as well as many Prudential Committee members and others, helping to carry out valuable objects from the church. The chairman of our building committee, Mr. John DeBate, had courageously managed to shut off the intake pipe to our gas furnaces in the cellar underneath the burning steeple. My older son had arrived early and soon suggested to Fire Chief Lewis Marshall that he withdraw his men from the steeple, lest our bell, the heaviest Paul Revere bell on record, having its support timbers burned and coming tumbling down to endanger the life of his men. Chief Marshall did this, and we were all relieved. And this, of course, explains why the fire was fought mainly by giant streams of water from the outside and lasted so long. When sufficiently under control by this method, firemen at last were able to ascend a ladder at the east end of the meeting house, go along the ridgepole to the base of the steeple, and enter it there to subdue the remnants of the conflagration. Some of the appreciation of what our firefighters accomplished was expressed when at last a fireman reached the bell and tapped it with his axe handle. The resounding tone brought forth instant applause and cheers from concerned spectators.
Happily, while the massive beams supporting the steeple and the bell were scorched, they did not burn. However, the flames, excessive heat, and floods of water from the fire hoses caused heavy damage to the interior of the meeting house. Only this eastern end, where the pulpit stands, was spared. Although Dr. Schacht had been looking forward to retirement, he threw himself into the work of restoring the meeting house, and I think several people among us today were part of that effort. The decision to do a complete restoration of the damaged sanctuary, rather than merely repair it, was made after a very short debate. Of course, this was the more expensive route to take, but in light of the church's designation as part of a National Historic Monument, there was little resistance. This decision, however, meant that additional funds were needed to supplement the insurance claim, since much of the restoration work was due to the passage of time, desired structural changes, and the expensive reproduction of the plaster work on the ceiling, and not simply to fire and water damage. In addition, a new organ had to be purchased and installed. The congregation rose to the challenge. A short but enthusiastic capital campaign drive was held and quickly raised over $2,000, the equivalent of $1.5 million today. With the insurance money and some funds from the endowment, the church was able to cover the total cost of $760,500. 2 years later, the restoration work was finally completed, and on December 8, 1968, the long-delayed 150th celebration was held. A special invitation was issued to the firemen who put out the fire. We have told the 200-year story of this wonderful building, Mr. Green's masterpiece, and perhaps gained a new respect for its value. We have observed the commitment of those who have been stewards of this magnificent space over 2 centuries. It has been 50 years since the last significant work was done on the Meeting House. We here have now inherited the challenge of maintaining John Holden Green's masterpiece. May we be worthy of that challenge.